else. Phil, would you like to have a wee chat to us about your Corona?
Where do I start? You know, if you've been torturing yourself by reading my articles in the magazine over the last few months, so we're up to number 8. I think I've got up to article about number 12, sort of drafted in one form or another, and the journey's not there yet. So this is pretty much where I got to by the end of the summer holidays, and I've not really touched it since. So I've got some other things going on at the moment that have been sucking my money and my car parts budget. I've just been away for a month with work, which hasn't helped, and so I've been collecting a few more bits to move on to the next stage of the completion of this. So the genesis of it really was having a collection of bits that needed a home, and having daughter number 2 getting towards the age where we started to learn how to drive, and sort of putting the two together, and you know, as you do when you have issues, you justify it. And so again, had the realization that a Corona body shell made a lot of sense to put those parts into. And part of it was because I had a sleeker rear end. Now it's got a more heavy duty one, but because this is a common floor pan, as I've written about in the articles, it made sense that the sort of body shell would be quite handy. Ideally, I wanted the model before. This is an 82 onwards, and I wanted the 78 to 82, but they're hard to get, more expensive, more rotten. And this one came up at the right price because it was in a paddock in Leaston. So this shell, which had live plates, cost me $600. It wasn't worth a lot more than that. It cost me about $700 to get a friend of a friend to A-frame at North, and then 20 odd grand later, we're about where we are now. It's still a budget project, but it's not cheap. The idea of it was to build something for Sophie that would be reliable, reasonably economical, a bit of fun, and a bit different, but still safe, notwithstanding no airbags, no ABS, those sorts of things. And something that, if she wanted to, you'd get her through sort of 10 odd years. So despite the fact that she aims to finish school and escape to Scotland, my goal was to give her something that, if she did stay in the country, she'd get through to her mid-20s with, you know, having a reliable car. So if she goes off to university, starts a job, or whatever it might be, she doesn't have to worry about a car for that period, as opposed to, you know, buying a, you know, $3 grand shit box that in 2 years' time is disintegrated, and you have to buy another one, and another one, and another one. So the motor in it is out of a Toyota Alteza. I've written about the various sagas with Altezas over the last few years. And this motor here has been stored for about 10, 11 years. It's got probably in the vicinity of 150,000 k on it. And we've got 3 of these, I think, in various things. And this one's probably the best of the lot. It just purrs like a kitten. So it's got a lot of life left in it yet, with the matching 6-speed gearbox. The rear axle in it is the heavy-duty Celica rear axle, which is quite rare. I got this one out of the States. It's a 7.5 inch. I could probably get away with a 6.7 inch, which is what these things come with stock, albeit with drums. And the ratio these come with isn't all that conducive to this package. But I sort of feel that because the Altezza runs the 7.5 inch rear end, and I can get one, it made a lot of sense. And there's pros and cons. The 7.5 inch rear end was relatively expensive to get, but the ratios and the limited slips are cheap. Whereas the T series, which is the 6.7 inch, like an 8086, the rear ends for this sort of thing are quite cheap, but the ratios and the LSDs are expensive. So it's a bit of a balancing act. But this rear end is good for nudging 500 horsepower. Not that it needs it. The standard rear end is good for maybe 200, and I'd be a bit worried about it. This literally makes 210 horsepower, and with the exhaust and the inlet manifold, the air filter, maybe it makes a little bit more because it's certainly got a bit of poke, which concerns me a little bit with that one. So we'll see how we go. So it's still very much a work in progress. I need to put shocks in it that retain the springs. I need to, there's lots of detail things, you know, stuff like that. There's a little bracket fixed behind here, which has disappeared. I can make something up, but we're thinking of going to Horapito, and we might go on a search and destroy mission and see if we can find a bracket. but the interior needs more of a makeover. The seats are actually on my Rotten Celica project, but again, same floor pans that are bolt in. But I've got some same vintage Supra seats, which have got more adjustment. They're kind of cool. They need reupholstering, and we want to try and look at reupholstering those to match the interior. The dash area is basically done. So this was a two-tone beige and brown interior. So we're going to black with hopefully a red accent, which kind of flips the body a little bit. Been trying to get some cloth similar to that. Can't. I then found out that the Ford Fiesta XR2 had a very similar cloth. They're called a laser fabric. Can't get that. I've tried. But you can get VW Golf or VW and Porsche fabric. And there's a Porsche tartan, because of course a German car with tartan in it. But a lot of the 70s Porsches actually had a tartan fabric in them. And there's a blacky reddy tartan that I think has got potential for just a bit of accent and to give it a bit of pop. We had thought vaguely about going beige-tastic on the inside and really going to town, which this was nodding, but I think black would be the way to go. So that's where Joanne and the girls need to break out the sewing machine and the likes for that. It needs a new windscreen. This is the original puffin screen, which I had to remove to fix some rock around the windscreen and to get it painted. So it's literally back in there with duct tape, but if it's good enough for aircraft, it's good enough for this, and the wind's blowing it on. So this is only slightly illegal at the moment, but it is safe-ish as long as it doesn't get airborne. So disc brake all round, vented on the front. It's currently got the same generation Supra front suspension in it. So that came, if you remember, there's the old 2.8i Supras or the 2.8 GLXi Crusaders. There's the brakes off one of those. So they're vented, they're reasonably beefy. Although I might put some Woolwoods on it, we'll see how we go. Disc brake rear end, Altezza master cylinder, Corona booster, parts been special, and it actually stops pretty well. One of the concerns, what I wanted to do was have it as externally as a survivor, if you like. So the aesthetic was as it came out the paddock, more or less, and the paint was pretty faded, to put it mildly. And I kind of liked that to an extent, but I gave it a bit of a rub, that it was sort of, it kind of came up a bit. So I spent a day with a buffer, and this is the result, with some cutting compound. And if you look at it closely, this door, this guard, and half the bonnet are not as good as the rest of it. And they're actually a respray. And I think, I don't know, but I suspect that these are a later paint system with a clear, whereas the original paint, I think is probably more as a Dulon or something. And so as a result, it's buffed up really pretty well, notwithstanding the fact that it's got rust coming through and all sorts of things. I'm really pleased how it come up. I quite like it, and so that's the bodywork is largely as it will be. There's very little rust in the actual external shell, and so my thought is, until such time as it actually needs some repair work, the rust progresses, we'll just leave it as it is, and that might at some point prompt a full panel and respray, but I like it like it is instead of safely. It's got most of this stuff, it's 40 years old, is restored, or it's repainted, or doesn't exist, and to have it more original, I think has an appeal, and that again matches the aesthetic. So they made a sporty variant of this, and these wheels were on that or some of its siblings, because they used the common floor pan. So they were 15 by 6, and the challenge is this as a base model would have had a 14-inch wheel, so it would have had a 185 70/14 tire. So matching this correctly for it is a 195 60/15. Given the performance of it, trying to find a performance tire in that was not easy. So we've got some Bridgestone Potenza Adrenaline RE 003s on a number of our cars in varying sizes. Joanne's got a CRX, which has got them in a 195/50/15, which I bought 2020, full set on the car, $660. These 10% profile higher, 195/60/15, $1,200 worth. So, there's a bit of money in the rubber on it, but it hooks up, and I think again from a safety and a holistic approach, it's a much better rubber for it. Trouble is they're just about replaceable, so once they're worn out, we'll have to go to something else. Look, I'll stop there because I can just prattle on forever, and it's probably better. Any questions that you'd like me to elaborate on?
So what were you going to do with the springs again?
Okay, so at the moment it's got Crowdown and Christchurch springs. Oh, I've forgotten the name. They're not Kings. But they're a New Zealand spring company. So set of aftermarket springs in the back, brand new, in the back, and that sits about right. And what it needs shocks that retain it.
Okay.
In the front, it's got the super struts, which it will have regardless. It'll just be a case of what brakes I put on it. And it's currently got AE86 aftermarket. I think these might actually be Lavelles, but they're like a King Spring. And I think the ride height and the stance is about right. I'm getting a little bit of rubbing on the front, which I think might be the mud flap, so I'll have to check that out. But currently the shocks are too long, so they're not retained. If you recall in the magazine, I don't know, probably 2 or 3 installments ago, I talked about a guy who's up Tauranga Way, who's got the model before this, the same basic floor pan. It's got the beams motor with the quad throttle bodies and all that on it, and they're nicely sourced and 225 horsepower wheels. He had a bunch of shocks he shortened because he does a bit of motorsport fabrication, and his one with some lowered springs, and then he went to adjustables. So I've got those shocks off them, which I will fit, and hopefully they'll retain. If not, I'll modify something so they do. Long story short.
Okay.
I see you've got adjustable strut tent tops.
Yes.
Are they a Toyota standard, or have you built them up?
No. So these, don't worry about the lock pins. This is the shock, the bolt start. There's not a thread engagement yet. So
I did notice the arc that it sort of expanded a little.
Yeah. So the super front strut of this vintage, which is the same as the Crusader, is here the 2.8i type thing. They've got a different strut angle in them. So if you look at the angle between the stub axle and the strut, it's a less upright angle than what these are. So if you put those struts in one of these, you end up with some positive camber. So to do that, you either need to push the bottom out or jerk the top in, hence the need for the camber plates. These camber plates are Nissan S14, S15 Sylvia, which if by slotting 2 of the holes by literally about 1 millimetre, hold it. So I've got those. And when I did my V8 Celica, which is rotting in the shed project, which again is the same body shell, that's got custom front struts, which are based on Nissan S14, where I cut the stub axle down to just a wee tube on the Supra strut, put all the Nissan bits onto it, and it's fully adjustable. But I didn't want to go that far with this. So my goal is to have in effect a standard strut, aftermarket spring, aftermarket shock, nothing overly fancy, and just a camber plate to correct the camber in it. I've had it aligned, and it's be all right. So the slip pins at the top at the moment because the shocks that are in it don't have enough thread engagement to go through the spherical joint. So that again, the shocks I'm getting have been modified, so they should fit.
Were you going to put a cold air box around the air filter or?
I've thought about it. Obviously, it'll benefit it, but to be fair, it's got enough power.
Did you think about putting a standard air filter in it just to make it look more Correct.
Yeah, so what's interesting is the Toyota Altezza's got quite a big plastic gearbox that fits in this corner, and it has a hot wire airflow meter, and it's integral with the gearbox. And the way I can describe it is it's kind of like a triangle pyramid type shape, and it's got the airflow meter in it, and then it comes out, and it's basically at a 90-degree. You got the airbox, the airflow meter is at a 90-degree to it. And you just look at it and go, that's appalling for flow. So when I first started messing with the Altezza motor, we got one of these airboxes, cut this little piece off that holds the airflow meter, turned it into a tube and put a pod filter on the end of it. And it started up and it idled just fine and it wouldn't rev out. And so that was really odd. We then put a factory airbox on and it ran fine. And after a lot of messing around, what we found was that for some reason, the airflow meter leads to turbulence, which is counted the V8s, anything else I've had with the Toyota that runs a hot wire airflow meter, doesn't care. But these ones really do. I ended up with a couple of different aftermarket pod filters. Got an Apexi one, I think I got an HKS one. This one's a Blitz. And the Apexi and the HKS, exactly the same. You put the actual airflow meter into the housing, put it in the car, idle's great, it won't run. This one, if you take the air filter off, there's a little bit of metal strap, which is probably 1/2 inch by, I don't know, good to mix things, 1/2 inch by about 2 mil thick. Which just, if you imagine if that's the opening that leads to the airflow meter, it sits just below halfway on edge. So it's a flat obstruction to the airflow, and this thing runs perfect. And I think there's just enough to tumble the air, and the airflow meter's happy with it. It's the most bizarre thing. So to come back to your question, yeah, I wanted to put the factory airbox in because I've tried to do the engine bay stockish, if Toyota made one of these. And the reality is it just was going to be a massive job to make it fit. So we put this on and it works.
Well, let's go on, please.
Yeah. I had thought about building a cold air box, which makes sense. But say the motor's 210 odd horse. To put it into perspective, they did make a twin cam turbo version of this, which I wrote about a couple of months ago, and they were about 160 odd horse. This is 210 if you believe the hype. That turbo motor was the Group B base engine, like much modified. But stock form 160 odd horse. So this has got more horsepower. It's got about the same torque, but the difference is it's a dual VVTi engine. So the valve timing on the first cam changes at about a bit over 5,000 RPM, and you can feel there's like quite a change in the power delivery. And then the second cam changes at about 6,500 RPM, and it just goes nuts. And it'll stream out to 8, and it's getting pretty exciting at that sort of time. And with that in mind, given the tyre size and everything else, I've got a spreadsheet I mess with, and I came across a 4.55 diff ratio for it. If this was running in an Altezza, it would have a 4.1. So I've got a couple of diff options within Toyota shorter. And so it'll do about 85k in second gear because it's so short geared, but it's a lot of fun because it's got that pickup. And as I wrote about in one of the articles, I've done a Nissan 6-gear conversion in the gearbox, which gives it a taller 6, which cancels out the shorter diff, and it runs allegedly, or by in theory, 40 revs more at motorway speed than it would in a stock car. So I'm really stoked from at least a holistic type thing, where it's, the gearing in it is fantastic for, having a bit of a play. So if any of the will should be sensible. But for cruising, it's just like the factory Altezza. Revs are really, sitting right where they should be. So it's quiet, it's smooth, it should be economical.
To my eye, I think you've got the aesthetic about right. I mean, you've got that survivor thing going on. Maybe you tighten up the bumpers and some of those things that are hanging off it. But then I like the kind of, if you look a bit deeper, you actually see it's got a resto underneath it.
Yeah.
So you lift the bonnet, there's no fooling yourself, but it starts and its wheels as well carry it.
Yeah.
So I think you've got just my eye, but I think you've got the balance about right.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I've got one of the articles I've got coming up is about the aesthetic, and so these wheels are reasonably iconic amongst the 80s Toyotas, and they came on a number of different cars, and they came in some different sort of variants, and they look fantastic with the flat faces polished, and either a black or like a dark gunmetal on the other parts. But these are raw, and some of the cars have them just raw. And again, I figured for this, they need a wheel that's not, polished up and shiny, because it wouldn't be right. I mean, we'll sort the bumper out, but that's probably about as far as it will go, externally. I've got minor things, that indicator's munted. So, I'll tidy those things up. It's got a cracked tail light, so I'll sort that out. But other than giving these probably a bit of a plastic polish, that'll be, again, I wanted it to look factory externally, sporty, and the thing that there's a what makes a car cool, and I think number one is stance, and and most cars benefit from being a little bit lower, a little bit of rake. The right, tire to arch sort of fitment, and that's in two dimensions as well. It's not just the vertical height, but also where the wheels sit in the guards. And if anything, the rears were flared badly by somebody, which I can't understand why, because I can't imagine how if we got tires on it would have needed it. So unfortunately, the rear lips are probably the best part of an inch out further than they should, and so as a result, the rear wheels tyres sit in a little bit more than I'd like. I bet you got some spaces I could perhaps put on it. But yeah, to me, if you get the right wheel, the right amount of tyre, that right fit to the guards, and also say that width piece, that just gives the car presence. And I do. I think it's about right. The shocks are shot at the moment, so the ride isn't where it should be, but it's not too harsh. I don't have a front sway bar at the moment. I've got to get one custom made to clear the sump. So I'll do that. It's got a sway bar in the back. But yeah, so I think it's that thing of, it's the stance that draws your eye to it. So it doesn't need a paint job and such. Right.
So, Phil, how are you placed for certification?
Yes, it needs it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, so,
Is that before or after you get caught?
well, so I've got a board meeting next week, but I've been talking to Ken about this and about maybe using it as it is for a certified training session.
That's probably not a good move.
Because it's a mixture of, if I say so myself, some very well executed bits and some really dodgy bits at the moment. There's about three things with it that I've got questions on. So the clearance between the rack and the engine sump on the driver's side is really pretty close. And so Ken's not seen it, but I've had a discussion with him, and it might actually be okay. It's one of these things, I'd like to see a bit more clearance there, but I think it's probably all right. It's got the factory fuel lines and brake lines through it, and with the 6-speed gearbox, where the gear lever is, pardon me, it's really close to the brake and fuel lines, but really close. There's about 10 mil clearance, and there's an element of I can't actually see how it's going to contact it. But if I was doing this as a scratch build, I wouldn't put the lines where they are. I'd put them a little bit further away. So is that actually an issue or not? We'll find that out. The brakes are another one. These brakes, with some new pads are probably up to the task. But I'm just thinking if I've got a set of Woolworths for it, and I might fit those, which would give it then a bit of overkill, but it's probably not a bad thing. But yeah, other than that, yep, I've got to retain the springs, I've got to do the shocks, but it should be a reasonably easy cert. There's no modifications to the body shell at all, other than slightly larger hole in the transmission tunnel to get the gear lever through, and a hole to put the wiring through for the engine. Otherwise, the body's completely stock. So in many respects, it should be an engine conversion level of cert as opposed to a scratch build. But it's gone from carbureted to injected. It's gone from a drum rear end to a disc, but the rear end's a factory stock bolt-in item. So it should be famous last words, a pretty simple cert.
There's no fabricated bits.
No. Well, so the engine mounts are aftermarket, billet aluminium, which I'd like to think will fly through. We'll see. Again, the part's been special. This thing came with, because it had the base model engine in it, and it had a T50 gearbox, which is what the A86, so the smaller engine cars run. But they had variants that had larger motors, like the turbo, and that had a W series superbox in it. And even though the Toyota 6-speed is completely different, the cross member for the superbox basically bolts up to the rubber mount on the 6-speed, albeit only 2 of the holes line up. So this has got a factory Toyota cross member in for the gearbox, not for the gearbox to sit it, but it lines up. Again, there's an issue over whether or not, this would ordinarily have 4 10mm bolts holding the rubber mount to the gearbox. Then that rubber mount's got 4 8mm bolts holding it to the cross member, and the cross member is held to the car by 4 8mm bolts. So if you look at obviously the 4 8mm bolts have got less strength than the 4 10mm bolts, but it's only got 2 of them. So if you look at it from that perspective, roughly on disc diameters, the gearbox is about 75% of factory attachment. I could modify the mount to put in the 4 10mm bolts. There's no principle to certify. Doesn't matter. You could probably argue either way. Yeah, but no. So other than the engine mounts, there's nothing fabricated as far as anything like that goes. Yeah, parts been special. Tell me, it's finding the parts. 40 years, not been that easy. But I got lucky, as I said, you've seen it in a few photos, and there's a rotten Super and a paddock in Whanganui. That's donated quite a few organs to this.
All right. If you're happy to wrap it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, really appreciate that, Phil. It's actually a really cool project. So look forward to sort of seeing the once it's on the road properly, and then you've done a lot of bits and pieces.